Imagine waking up one day and realizing that nothing is technically wrong with your life, yet something feels profoundly off. Your phone lights up before your eyes fully open. Notifications stack like promises waiting to be unwrapped. Messages, headlines, numbers that glow green or red. You haven't even stood up, and already the world is asking for your attention. You scroll. A small pulse of pleasure flickers through you. Not joy, not meaning, just a subtle internal click, as if a switch has been flipped somewhere deep in your nervous system. You scroll again and again. Each movement feels voluntary, but also strangely inevitable, like gravity disguised as choice. Now pause. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. When was the last time you felt truly bored? So bored that your mind had nowhere to escape? Not distracted boredom. Not, I'll check something real quick boredom. Real boredom. The kind that stretches time. The kind that forces you to sit with yourself. That silence has almost vanished. And no one is panicking. Because this isn't an addiction in the way we've been taught to recognize addiction. There's no needle. No bottle hidden in a drawer. No dramatic collapse that forces an intervention. You're still functional. Productive. Maybe even admired. And yet, you keep reaching. You reach for stimulation the way lungs reach for oxygen. Not because it's extraordinary, but because the absence of it feels intolerable. The moment life slows down, you feel a faint anxiety crawl up your spine. A restlessness. An urge to fill the gap. So you fill it. With content. With noise. With updates. With novelty. With anything that gives you that brief neurological reward that says, yes. Here's the paradox. You have more access to pleasure than any human in history, and yet you feel more empty, more restless, more unsatisfied than ever before. How can abundance create deprivation? You're not exhausted because life is too hard. You're exhausted because it never stops stimulating you. Every spare moment is colonized. Waiting in line, riding in a car, sitting alone at night. There is always something to consume. Always something new. Always something engineered to hold your attention just a fraction longer than the last thing. And you call this normal. But what if it isn't? What if the problem isn't lack of discipline, motivation, or purpose, but overstimulation masquerading as freedom? Consider this. If someone needed a chemical hit every few minutes just to feel okay, we'd call it dependency. If someone couldn't sit alone with their thoughts without discomfort, we'd call it avoidance. But when the source is digital, cultural, and socially approved, we shrug and say, that's just how the world works now. Is it? Or have we quietly normalized a system that keeps us perpetually wanting? Never satisfied, never settled, never still? You chase motivation, but it slips through your fingers. You chase happiness, but it fades faster each time. You chase meaning, but your attention is fragmented into so many pieces that nothing has the space to become meaningful. And here's the most unsettling part. You may not even feel trapped. That's how deep it goes. Because the new addiction doesn't feel like craving, it feels like choice. It doesn't feel like chains, it feels like convenience. It doesn't feel like escape, it feels like connection. Yet something is being eroded. Slowly, invisibly. Your capacity to wait. Your tolerance for discomfort. Your ability to be alone with yourself without needing a hit of stimulation to soften the silence. And without those capacities, something essential begins to die, not dramatically, but quietly. Creativity, depth, presence, meaning. So ask yourself, without flinching this time, if you removed all artificial stimulation for one day, no scrolling, no endless novelty, no constant rewards, who would you be when nothing is feeding your dopamine? Would you feel calm or panicked, grounded or empty, free or unbearably restless? This is the question most people never stop long enough to ask, because stopping itself has become uncomfortable. And that discomfort? That's not a flaw. That's a signal. A signal that something powerful has taken root beneath the surface of modern life. Something shaping your desires, your focus, your identity, while remaining largely unnamed. We don't call it an addiction, but maybe that's exactly why it's winning. The problem didn't arrive suddenly. It didn't crash through the door. It seeped in quietly, disguised as progress. At first, it promised efficiency, then connection, then entertainment, and finally, relief. Relief from boredom, relief from uncertainty, relief from having to sit too long with your own thoughts. But the human mind was never designed for endless relief. Deep inside you is a system far older than civilization itself, a reward mechanism that evolved to help you survive. Dopamine was never meant to make you happy. It was meant to make you pursue food, safety, social belonging, meaningful goals that required effort, patience, and risk. The problem begins when that ancient system is hijacked, when reward becomes detached from effort, when anticipation replaces fulfillment, when stimulation arrives instantly and infinitely. The mind starts to change. Not metaphorically, biologically. Each hit of novelty trains your brain to expect the next one. Each swipe lowers the threshold for satisfaction. Each moment of instant gratification quietly rewires your tolerance for effort, depth, and delay. And here's the twist most people miss. Dopamine doesn't reward pleasure, it rewards the chase. Which means a life built around constant stimulation doesn't feel satisfying. It feels restless. You're always leaning forward, always anticipating, always just one click away from the next emotional micro-hit that never quite lands. This is why abundance feels like starvation. Philosophers warned us long before algorithms existed. One spoke of the endless striving of desire, how the human will, once unrestrained, becomes a source of suffering rather than fulfillment. Another warned that when comfort becomes the highest value, humanity doesn't collapse into pain, but into distraction. A painless emptiness, a shallow happiness that slowly erodes depth. And psychology confirms it. The mind adapts quickly to pleasure, but slowly to meaning. What once felt exciting becomes baseline. What once felt rewarding becomes expected. And what once felt sufficient becomes intolerably dull. So you escalate. More content, more stimulation, faster rewards, shorter attention cycles. You're not weak. You're responding exactly as a human nervous system does when flooded with artificial signals of importance. The hidden problem isn't technology itself. It's the removal of friction. Friction is what gives actions weight. Waiting, struggling, failing, repeating. These were the gates that separated impulse from fulfillment. And when those gates vanish, desire loses its structure. Think about it. For most of human history, effort preceded reward. Now reward precedes effort, or bypasses it entirely. And the brain, confused but compliant, begins to lose its sense of direction. This is where identity starts to erode. Because identity is built through commitment, through choosing something difficult and staying with it long enough for meaning to emerge. But dopamine culture fragments commitment. It encourages sampling over depth, novelty over mastery, stimulation over stillness. Why stay when you can switch? Why endure discomfort when relief is instant? Why build meaning when you can consume it prepackaged? Existential philosophers described a condition where freedom becomes overwhelming, not liberating. When every option is available, nothing feels necessary. When nothing is necessary, choice becomes anxiety, and anxiety seeks relief. So you distract yourself, not because life is unbearable, but because silence is. There's a shadow side to this, one that analytical language often fails to capture. When stimulation becomes constant, the psyche never fully descends into itself. There's no descent into boredom, no confrontation with emptiness, no reckoning with unresolved questions. And without that descent, something essential remains undeveloped. The part of you that knows how to wait, the part that tolerates uncertainty, the part that wrestles with meaning instead of outsourcing it. Psychology calls this avoidance. Philosophy calls it inauthenticity. But in daily life, it just feels like being busy. And that's why it's so dangerous. Because busyness looks like purpose. Engagement looks like connection. Consumption looks like fulfillment. And no one questions it, especially when everyone is doing the same thing. But beneath the surface, a subtle dependency forms. Not on a substance, but on stimulation itself. You don't crave the phone. You crave the feeling the phone gives you. You don't need the content. You need the relief from being unstimulated. You don't fear missing out. You fear being left alone with yourself. This is the root most people never reach. The dopamine culture didn't create emptiness. It taught us how to avoid noticing it. And the longer emptiness is avoided, the louder it becomes, demanding more noise, more novelty, more distraction just to stay quiet. Yet something else is happening at the same time, something even more unsettling. The consequences aren't just internal. They don't stop at mood or motivation. They ripple outward, shaping relationships, creativity, politics, culture itself, subtly, relentlessly. And most people won't see it until they recognize themselves inside it. That recognition is uncomfortable, which is exactly why the next layer remains unseen. The most dangerous effects are never the loud ones. They don't announce themselves as crises. They don't trigger alarms. They slip into daily life so smoothly that you mistake them for personality traits, for mood, for just how things are now. You tell yourself you're tired, unmotivated, burned out. But what if you're not exhausted from doing too much? What if you're exhausted from never fully arriving anywhere? Dopamine culture fractures attention, and attention is not just a mental resource. It's the foundation of reality as you experience it. What you attend to determines what feels real. What feels real determines what matters. And what matters determines who you become. When attention is constantly hijacked, life loses continuity. Moments no longer build on each other. They reset. You jump from stimulus to stimulus, each one briefly intense, none of them lasting long enough to sink roots. This is why so many people feel strangely disconnected from their own lives, as if they're watching themselves from a slight distance. You're present, but not inhabiting the moment. Engaged, but not absorbed. Involved, but not committed. Neurologically, the brain adapts to rapid novelty by prioritizing speed over depth. Reflection becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels unnatural. Long-term thinking feels heavy. The mind starts craving constant input the way a muscle used to rest twitches when forced to be still. And so the cycle tightens. You avoid stillness because it feels wrong. Stillness feels wrong because you've avoided it too long. Over time, this reshapes emotional life. Small frustrations feel bigger. Delayed rewards feel unbearable. Ordinary moments feel flat, even when they're meaningful. You begin to confuse intensity with significance. If something doesn't spike emotion immediately, it feels irrelevant. If it requires patience, it feels like a burden. If it doesn't reward you quickly, it feels pointless. Relationships quietly change under this pressure. Listening deeply becomes harder. Silence between words feels awkward. Conflict becomes intolerable, not because it's severe, but because it's uncomfortable and slow to resolve. People start to feel replaceable, interchangeable, scrollable. Why work through friction when novelty is endless? And yet, something hollow spreads beneath all of it. Loneliness increases even as connectivity explodes. Anxiety rises even as convenience peaks. Depression deepens not from lack, but from excess, from too many signals screaming importance, leaving none of them truly important. On a cultural level, this creates volatility. Outrage spreads faster than understanding. Simplified narratives outperform complex truths. Emotional spikes drown out sustained thought. What captures attention becomes power, not what holds meaning. This isn't accidental. Systems optimized for engagement don't care whether the engagement nourishes you or depletes you. They only care that you return. So you do, not because you're weak, but because your nervous system is being trained. Over time, self-trust erodes. You stop trusting your ability to focus, to stay with discomfort, to follow a single thread of thought to its end. You start outsourcing regulation of mood, of boredom, of meaning to external inputs. And the more you outsource, the less capable you feel without them. That's the quiet dependency. Not dramatic enough to notice. Not painful enough to force change. Just numbing enough to keep you compliant. You might recognize it in the way days blur together. In the sense that time is moving faster, yet nothing feels deeply lived. In the strange guilt of being unproductive while also feeling overstimulated. In the feeling that you're always behind messages, behind trends, behind your own potential. And here's the most unsettling consequence of all. When stimulation becomes constant, desire loses its compass. You want things, but you're no longer sure why. You pursue goals, but they don't satisfy when reached. You feel restless, but can't name what's missing. This creates a low-grade existential tension. Not a dramatic crisis, but a dull ache. A sense that something essential is being postponed indefinitely. So you keep yourself occupied, busy enough not to notice, entertained enough not to ask, stimulated enough not to stop. But occasionally, late at night, or in rare moments of stillness, the question slips through. Is this it? Not in a catastrophic way, in a quiet, unsettling way. Because if this is it If endless stimulation, shallow rewards, and perpetual distraction are the peak, then something inside you knows it's being underfed. That knowledge is uncomfortable, which is why the system teaches you to scroll past it. But discomfort, when faced instead of avoided, has a strange property. It points somewhere. And the very restlessness that feels like a problem may be the first sign of resistance, an unarticulated protest against a life designed to keep you stimulated but never satisfied. The next step isn't obvious. It doesn't feel natural. In fact, it initially feels like moving backward. It requires questioning the assumption that relief is always good, that comfort is always progress, that stimulation is always life. It requires something closer to rebellion. Not loud, not performative, but internal and deeply destabilizing to the system that depends on your constant engagement. Because once you see the trap, the question changes. It's no longer why am I so distracted? It becomes who would I be without the distraction? And answering that question requires a kind of courage most people never practice. Rebellion rarely begins with noise. It begins with refusal, a quiet, almost imperceptible decision to stop responding automatically, to pause where you once reacted, to stay where you once escaped. Not as an act of discipline, but as an act of curiosity. What happens if you don't reach? The first thing you discover is discomfort. Not dramatic pain, something subtler. A low hum of restlessness. An itch in the mind. A sense that you're missing something important, even when nothing is actually happening. This is where most people turn back. They interpret discomfort as danger, as failure, as a sign that something is wrong. But the rebellion begins when you reinterpret that signal entirely. What if discomfort isn't the enemy, but the doorway? For centuries, those who broke free from psychological traps didn't do it by adding more stimulation, but by subtracting, by stepping into silence, by enduring boredom long enough for it to transform into something else. Because boredom, when not immediately anesthetized, mutates. At first it feels empty, then irritating, then vaguely anxious. But if you stay, if you don't flee, it opens into something unexpected, awareness. Thoughts slow down, sensations sharpen, time stretches. You begin to notice how compulsive your impulses really are, not as commands, but as suggestions you've been obeying without question. This is the first radical shift. You stop treating urges as orders. An urge is just energy. Dopamine is just a signal. Neither is destiny. When you resist immediate gratification, not heroically, not forever, just for a moment, you create friction. And friction is not punishment. It's structure. Structure allows meaning to form. This is why so many transformative traditions, philosophical, spiritual, psychological, begin with restraint. Not repression, but containment. They understood something modern culture forgot. Without limits, desire becomes chaotic. With limits, it becomes directional. You don't need to abandon technology. You don't need to escape society. You don't need to become extreme. You need to reintroduce delay. Delay between impulse and action. Delay between want and fulfillment. Delay between boredom and relief. At first, this feels like loss, like deprivation, like swimming upstream. But something strange happens when you persist. Your nervous system recalibrates. What once felt intolerably slow begins to feel calm. What once felt boring begins to feel rich. The mind, no longer bombarded, starts producing its own material, memories, ideas, questions, images. Creativity returns, not as inspiration, but as overflow. This is the second rebellion. You stop outsourcing stimulation. Instead of constantly consuming meaning, you begin to generate it. Instead of reacting, you initiate. Instead of chasing motivation, you let it arise naturally from engagement with something difficult and real. Difficulty becomes attractive again, not masochistically, but because effort starts to feel rewarding in a way stimulation never was. There's a deeper satisfaction in doing something slowly, imperfectly, persistently. This is where identity begins to reform. You become someone who can stay, someone who can focus, someone who can endure the awkward middle where nothing pays off yet. And that changes everything. Because the dopamine trap relies on fragmentation. It needs you scattered, jumping, reacting, skimming the surface of experience. The rebellion gathers you back into yourself. You begin to choose fewer things, but choose them more fully. You trade novelty for depth, You accept that meaning is not immediately pleasurable, but it is stable. And stability does something pleasure cannot. It gives you a place to stand. This doesn't make life easier. In some ways, it makes it harder. You feel more. You confront unresolved questions. You notice dissatisfaction you once numbed. You encounter parts of yourself that were drowned out by noise. But you also recover something rare: agency. You stop living as a node in a feedback loop and start living as a participant in your own life. The world doesn't lose its pull overnight. The impulses don't vanish. The system doesn't collapse just because you see it. But you're no longer inside it unconsciously. And that awareness is destabilizing in the best possible way. Because once you realize how much of your behavior was conditioned, the idea of reclaiming control stops feeling abstract. It becomes practical, personal, urgent. You begin to ask different questions. Not, how do I feel better right now? But what kind of person am I becoming? Not what will entertain me, but what will deepen me. Not what's easiest, but what's worth enduring. And these questions lead somewhere most people never reach. Not because it's hidden, but because it requires patience. They lead to a realization so simple it's easy to miss. One that reframes the entire struggle. One that reveals the strange truth behind desire, dissatisfaction, and the constant chase that defined your life for so long. A truth that doesn't just help you resist the dopamine culture, but makes its grip finally loosen. At some point, if you stay with the discomfort long enough, a quiet realization emerges, not as a thought, but as a felt understanding. You were never chasing pleasure. You were chasing relief. Relief from restlessness. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from the open-endedness of being alive without instructions. Dopamine culture didn't create that need. It simply offered an endless supply of temporary answers to a question you never learned how to sit with. And here is the truth that reframes everything. The discomfort you've been avoiding is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that something in you is still alive. That restlessness, it's not pathology. That boredom, not a defect. That dissatisfaction, not failure. They are signals of unused capacity. In a world engineered to soothe you constantly, discomfort becomes the last remaining proof that you are not fully domesticated. That some part of you still resists being reduced to a consumer of sensations. The final realization is this: meaning does not compete with dopamine on its terms. Meaning is not immediate. It is not intense. It does not arrive with fireworks or notifications. Meaning emerges slowly, through commitment, through endurance, through staying present long after novelty has faded. And this is why dopamine culture feels so powerful. It offers what meaning cannot: speed, certainty, predictability. But what it cannot offer is depth. Depth requires time. Depth requires friction. Depth requires the courage to feel unsatisfied long enough for something real to take shape. When you understand this, the struggle changes. You stop asking, how do I get rid of this restlessness? You start asking, what is this restlessness pointing toward? Because restlessness is directional. It is the energy of a life not yet fully claimed. The reason endless stimulation feels hollow is not because you need better stimulation. It's because your nervous system is starving for engagement with something that resists you, something that pushes back, something that doesn't instantly reward you, something that forces you to grow in order to continue. This is the kind of engagement that builds identity, not the identity of preferences and playlists and opinions, but the deeper identity of someone who knows what they can endure, what they can shape, what they are willing to commit to even when it's uncomfortable. Once you see this, the illusion cracks. You realize that the endless chase was never going to end because it was never meant to. Dopamine doesn't want satisfaction. It wants pursuit. And you don't escape the trap by winning the chase. You escape it by stepping out of it, by choosing fewer things and choosing them with seriousness, by letting boredom mature instead of medicating it, by allowing silence to feel awkward until it becomes honest, by accepting that a meaningful life will often feel less exciting, but far more solid. This doesn't mean joy disappears. It changes. Joy stops being a spike and becomes a background warmth, a quiet confidence, a sense that even when life is difficult, it is coherent. You no longer need to constantly ask, what's next? Because you're finally somewhere. And here's the most paradoxical part of all. When you stop chasing dopamine, pleasure actually returns. Not as compulsion, but as resonance. Not as escape, but as accompaniment. Simple things regain their texture. Time slows. Attention stabilizes. You begin to feel more alive not because life is louder, but because you are finally present enough to hear it. The system doesn't collapse. The world doesn't change overnight. But you do. You become harder to manipulate, not because you're resistant, but because you're rooted. You don't need constant reassurance. You don't panic at silence. You don't confuse motion with progress. You know the difference between stimulation and meaning. And once you know that difference, you can never fully go back. Because you've seen the cost of the trade you were making: depth for speed, coherence for convenience, presence for pleasure. The new addiction loses its power the moment you stop calling discomfort an enemy and start treating it as a guide back to yourself. So the final question isn't how to escape dopamine culture. It's simpler and far more demanding. What are you willing to stay with long enough for meaning to emerge? Whatever your answer is, that's where your life actually begins.